Thank you. Good afternoon. I know I'm the closing keynote speaker. I'm looking forward to your questions. So I'm talking about diagnostics. Diagnostics is medical testing. You all had lab tests done, and I am very excited about this industry, and I'll talk about some trends and challenges. My challenge is, in fact, to do it in 10 minutes or less. So it's a very complex industry. So I've taken the liberty to pick some topics to give you an idea. My perspective is one, I've been a CEO for a long time, so I know really nothing in detail, but I know everything a little bit. You want to be healthcare executives, maybe entrepreneurs, maybe run an institution or a company. So I give you a perspective on kind of what works, what doesn't work, what do I know. The first thing you have to know is in diagnostics, it's a device. It could be a computer, a robot, it could be a test. It's something that you have to invent. It's a device, and it has to replace something else, so it has to be better. So you're making widgets, more or less, sometimes very complicated ones. So you have to have an interest in technology, and that's why I'm going to start with technologies. And there's a lot of it. There's a lot of technologies. There's genetic sequencing. There is actually very useful genetic sequencing in diagnostic today, where you can look at the makeup of a tumor and say, when you do targeted sequencing, what therapy works. Cancer therapy selection, very good application. There's ultra-sensitive protein detections. Proteins are very important in diagnostics, but they're not always visible. So there's new technology available, a company that I work with on the board, that makes neurological markers available in a simple blood test. This could be very major because it could diagnose diseases without doing imaging. For example, for traumatic brain injury or for Alzheimer's. So there's some major innovations going on right now. We heard a little bit about glucose monitoring. I worked in this field for a long time. Today, you can do continuous glucose monitoring with a little patch on your arm connected to a pump. That's more or less artificial pancreas. That's a major innovation. There are 30 million diabetics in the United States and probably 3 times as much in the world. A big, big disease. So there's some real interesting innovations going on. There's metabolomics. It's basically the science of looking at components of your metabolism and looking at concentration. That is very sophisticated technology that you combine with AI and you get new insights. That's also starting to get into clinical use. And there's digital physiology, which I'm very excited about. And this is like I would say the Apple 4 or 5 watch that can do AFib monitoring maybe in the future. But that's pretty far out, I would say. I'm personally a big tracker of all kinds of physiological data, but I do think it has transformational potential, not because of the information, because how it engages people with themselves. So I think this has tremendous opportunity. And obviously, there's some examples, very small examples, of using data science, AI, to automate processes like reading images, and that's also being used today. So lots of technologies that are possible. And when you look at a business, usually there's an inventor that has some of this, and they say, oh, this is the greatest thing. The key question is, how does it fit into the healthcare market? Because there are really important structures that you have to know. So very briefly on the lab market. The lab market is basically laboratories around the world, and they're usually large. And they're getting larger and larger because of cost pressure. So today, a big lab can process 10,000 patient samples in an hour, and it's basically a big factory with a lot of robots. That's the environment you're selling into. So how do you fit into that? That's very important to know. They don't cover everything. There are also small labs, so point-of-care testing. Different technology, again, different customer requirement. But the majority of the testing that is useful today and that is done today is in large labs, hospital labs, core labs, private labs, global lab chains. So whenever you have an innovation, you have to think about this. So how does it fit into that customer's environment? They don't want to buy new equipment. They want something that fits into their system because they're part of a healthcare system, a hospital system that says, we would like to get this test result produced for 10 cents. Yes, I mean, these diagnostics are very, very affordable because they've been made so efficient, and that's the majority of the business. So as an innovator, as a new company, you have to see how you fit in. Is it a workflow solution? Is it a new robot? Is it a new software? Is it a new test? So understanding that is critical. There's another very important part is that these laboratories make this testing now available to people in different points. You can go to pharmacy and you get your test done. There are 22 states now where you can get direct access to your lab testing. It's not known much, but it's allowed now, no physician. And the last point I would make, and I could spend a day on talking about China, because as a company in diagnostics, you usually operate on a global basis. China is going to be the largest diagnostic market in the next 5 years, bigger than the United States. China is building their own diagnostics industry. And guess what? They're not going to do it like we did it. They're going to do it differently, much cheaper, much faster, and in their own way. And these products will also be available. So there's a whole industry growing in China very fast. That's going to be very interesting to see when it comes to the United States. Consumer diagnostics, another trend that I think is critical today. We heard a little bit about it today. 23andMe was mentioned. You know what it is. It's a genetic testing service. So why is it important and why is it successful? I don't know. I've done 23andMe. I'm a big fan. And I found out that I have 97% more Neanderthal genes than anyone else. So what is it good for? I don't know. It's for entertainment, right? So a friend of mine said, well, that explains a lot. OK, thank you. It's basically people want to know what they're made of. They go back and look at ancestry. The medical side is, I would say, embryonic. You get maybe 40 different mutations for diseases you pass down to your kids. OK, that's useful. But the medical side is not really fully useful yet. The point is that there are millions of people who are interested in their genetic information they want to know, and that's an important trend. The other important trend is chronic disease self-management. It's very much, if you have diabetes, type 1 diabetes, or any chronic condition, you really become an expert in your disease. And they said you have a PhD in your disease, and if you usually know more about your disease, your situation, than the doctor. And the doctor becomes sort of a coach over time. That's an important trend. Direct access to lab testing, talked about that. MyQuest 360 is an app from Quest Diagnostics that has millions of users, and you just go there, you get your lab results, and you get interpretive help. My company gives incentives for people to do their annual physical and get their lab tests done. Why do you do that? Because that creates awareness for people taking control of their own healthcare. Digital wellness tracking is also an important one. There are companies that give discounts and incentives to wear a Fitbit. I don't know if that's good or bad, but at least you know you're doing something. You're moving around, you're doing your sports, and you can see that. That's a major trend. And digital biomarkers is also something that's becoming, it's more cutting edge, but it's becoming more and more interesting. There are companies developing apps to measure cognitive function. So if you use your cell phone, they can see whether that changes over time. And there's probably a big difference between me using my cell phone and my kids. There must be a big difference. But there's actually that you can draw conclusions on cognitive differences here. Let's talk about some of the barriers and challenges. And again, as a business person, that is absolutely critical. It takes, in my business, 5 to 10 years to get a new test really adopted in the market. So when you think about, you have this one invention, this great invention, this, I don't know, the new detection system, new assay. Before you have really sales, it'll take you 5 to 6, 7 years. So you have to fund that. So this is very important to know. And the main reason is really people like technology, like to look at it, but it takes a while to get this adopted in standard of care. It takes a while to get this approved. It takes a while to get this really into the system overall. You might have a few customers, like a Mayo Clinic, they use it for a year, but there's no broad adoption. Second, in this market, you need a lot of data. So you need analytical data, you need clinical data, you need outcome data. So you have to do studies to prove that you actually have something different, and that costs money. You have entrenched players. Usually in this market, company of 2 billion in revenues is probably a medium player. There are many players who like 6, 7, or 8 billion or more. Usually part of big pharmaceutical companies, so you need a certain capital here to be competitive. There's price pressure. There always is in healthcare. So unlike in pharmaceutical, where you can actually raise prices or you have completely new pricing, prices are pretty set. And so there are a lot of ways to you reduce the price over time. And so there's a certain uncertainty about innovation. So you have to know how do you go to market, how do you price your product in advance to your investment decision. That is critical. Regulatory approvals are significant, so usually FDA approved. China is now the market that takes the longest to approve new products, and Europe is also changing their regulatory framework right now to something that resembles more the FDA. And it's complex commercially. You need selling capabilities at different levels, you need a direct sales force, you need to call on different call points, you need a service infrastructure. So all this sounds like horrific. Why would you get into that business? No, it's actually a great business. Because the one big advantage of all this is that the barriers to entry are high. So you have a sticky business, you have a long-term business, and you can sell products for a very long time. So it's a very good business, a $50 billion industry, grows about 5 to 6% a year worldwide. And it really makes a difference in healthcare. But you have to know these barriers and challenges. If you're just a technology-focused company, you will not succeed. I want to talk a little bit about changes in health management from a diagnostic standpoint. I do believe from the trends I've seen in consumer diagnostics that we're moving away from this more physician-controlled paternalistic system to really a system where you get coached by your physician and you have all the information. I do think there are some very good examples where you're moving much more to a proactive health management. So when it comes to, for example, cancer predisposition testing, I do think that a patient should have access to their lab information 100% all the time, and they should drive the decisions on what to do with the lab data. The physician will coach, but that is certainly something that will enable people to do different things. I do think that digital physiology has tremendous potential. We're just seeing the very beginning of that because it can inform us about things we never knew. And it doesn't have to be a blood test, I think, but there are many applications that are being developed in digital physiology that could be very useful for wellness. And in precision medicine, when it comes to these very targeted diagnostics, they will decide what therapy you get, and they will decide exactly whether this therapy is good for you. And precision medicine will have a lot of potential on pharmaceuticals. I can't predict how fast this goes and which one, but these are all changes that are going on right now. I'll give you one example to close before we go on the discussion. And this is not a company, this is just a concept that I found at a digital healthcare conference. And I decided to show this here because it's probably, in terms of testing and data, it's the most comprehensive system that I've seen. So the idea is you create a digital twin of yourself. You collect all the data that's available. It could be your genetic data, it could be your medical data, your sociograph, your family history. You store this, and then you build a simulation engine of what if? What if you you're 10 pounds overweight, you have this HbA1c, you're not moving much, you're not doing any sports, you have this family history. What happens to your health, to your trajectory in the next 10 years? If you know that, it's your digital twin. You say, oh, I'm going to get sick in 10 years. It's based on really defense industry predictive modeling, and it has a number of implications. So you could use it on an individualized basis. You can say, okay, if we do this intervention and put you on a drug, or we put you on this diet, we can predict that your disease curve will not go in that direction, will actually go in this direction, and the model would show that. So can you imagine you had that information with a patient in front of you, how different this would be managing their wellness? I think it would be quite actionable. You could, of course, do the same on a population basis and say, okay, now we combine a whole group of people and say, how can we manage this group in a systematic way? To me, it has a lot of potential implications for public health, for example, because all of a sudden you get a whole host of data that is available today. It's a completely data science approach. There's no new information, no new technology need to get. The only difference is it's the application of how that information is used to predict what will happen. This system could be an app. It could be an app that you use yourself. It could be part of a program of a public health system. It could be used by pharmaceutical companies to predict how, basically on the computer, how their drug would work in a certain population. So I think this is kind of the example I like the most about consumer-empowered wellness management, but it's also one that is probably the furthest away from the market. So with that, I come briefly on conclusions. So I do believe that data science-based approaches will be tremendous in the long term, but it will take time. Like any innovation, any of these approaches, they have to go through analytical validation, they have to go through clinical validation, and they have to go through regulatory approval. I do think today I see genetic testing and ultra-sensitive protein diagnostics are probably the ones that are really moving forward now pretty rapidly into broader clinical adoption and commercial stage. And the commercial risk in diagnostics have to be known. If you want to get into that diagnostic business, eyes wide open, it takes capital, it takes time, but once you have a business, it's fantastic. And last, I think consumer diagnostics, if it does enable people and get them to a different motivation level, could be completely transformational without any really new technological innovation. It's all in the application. So that's what I had to say. Thank you very much. And we'll move over to, how did I do on time?
You did great.
I did great. OK. So now we move over to questions. Okay.
So that was spectacular. That was, I work on Alzheimer's, I work on oncology, on data science, and on biomarkers. So I'm thrilled to be here. Thank you. But at the very start of the talk, Martin, you talked about Alzheimer's, and I want to explore that topic a little bit more with you. One of the challenges that we have with Alzheimer's is that the diagnosis is not very good. And it often happens too late. It often happens when it's Alzheimer's dementia, as opposed to much earlier. And if we knew that it was going to happen earlier, maybe we could enroll our parents or grandparents in clinical trials. Maybe we could take our parents or grandparents on trips around the world before the Alzheimer's became Alzheimer's dementia. So help me understand where you think the technology of superior diagnosis via better diagnostics is when it comes to Alzheimer's.
Yeah. So today we have imaging, which is basically a technology that detects amyloid deposits in the brain. And that usually happens, pretty far down the road. Yeah. So that's the problem. With ultrasensitive protein diagnostics, you can detect certain proteins, there are a number of them. They have all kinds of names, A, beta 42, and tau, and so on. And you can detect them with a technology that's about 1,000 times more sensitive. So there is the blood-brain barrier, and you can detect these markers today if you do a blood sample, a regular blood sample. You can see that these markers are elevated. The question now is, and it is in, I would say, in the biomarker development stage, it's not in clinical use yet. The question is, how do you design a clinical trial that would do what you said? Can you do early? But even if you didn't have really the right treatment yet, there are a lot of biopharmaceutical companies interested in exactly this application. And that's why you see a lot of business volume in that segment today. They want to see what they could see before anything shows up on imaging. So I think it's a good field, very promising. It'll take a few years to get to the trials, but I would say there are at least 4 or 5 different markers that could be very good candidates.
One of the things you often hear from biopharma companies is that in the chance that they were successful with the drug for Alzheimer's, they would struggle with the fact that there are just not enough PET scanners in America to diagnose people with Alzheimer's. And what I'm hearing from you is maybe that's sort of not really much of a challenge. We have a diagnostic test that can be done very easily, that doesn't require us to be building PET scanners all over America.
Yeah, that's the ambition. We should not do imaging for these people because it's too late. It's basically not sensitive enough. There's another marker called NFL, which is for MS, which basically we think it could be like a general health indicator of what basically happens in the brain. And it's a subset of a neurofilament that you can detect with an ultrasensitive technology. And it shows that, in MS, you can probably detect it much earlier. MS, the same problem. Once you see the lesions, it's too late. So it's a fundamental limitation of imaging technology that I don't know if it can be overcome. But with a protein test, it's first of all simple, and you're much closer to the pathophysiology of that patient. So it's pretty obvious that if you can detect it, it will work.
So what advice do you give, from a business strategy perspective to companies in this area? Because on the one hand, if you have such a protein diagnostic and a patient tests positive for early stage Alzheimer's, then what it means is that patient has to now be treated with whatever drug may be available in the future. And so payers might say to you, I don't really want to cover this diagnostic because the minute I have this diagnostic, the diagnostic may be cheap, but it brings the full cost of the care. Now there's another strategy where we don't sell the diagnostic to the payer. We sell it directly to the patient. How does one think about the strategy here? Is this do I sell to payers? Do I sell to patients?
So I will answer the question. It's a really good question with an analogy. So go back to the days of PCR. PCR is a very important diagnostic technology that's now used in all kinds of things. Before PCR, you could not really treat HIV well because you didn't know how much virus was in the patient. So with HIV monitoring testing with PCR, you were able to say, okay, there is so much viral load that we need to bring that viral load down to a certain level, and you know that the therapy works. So the direct linkage of a diagnostic assay in a critical disease to a therapeutic intervention drives it forward. And that test was adopted very rapidly. So I think the same can happen here. And that's why the clinical data are so critical. So if you have compelling clinical data, that what I basically proposed, that this marker would really initiate MS therapy earlier, you have a business. So that's why business strategy, if you think that's a good indication, you should really invest into the clinical trials that prove that. That would be my recommendation.
So now let me come to the very end of your talk. We started with the Alzheimer's point that you made at the beginning, but at the end, you've concluded something that we very rarely see discussed, which is that at the end of the day, so much of the spending on healthcare could be reduced if we could get folks to engage in better behaviors. And forgive me for this, I'm an economist, so economists always think about behavior change as being the hardest thing to do. But you have a very optimistic narrative around how consumer diagnostics might help not only in the diagnosis of disease, but they might actually be able to induce healthier behavior. So help me understand that more. Yeah. How's my phone or my watch going to, my wife is telling me all the time to work out and I'm not listening to her. You have to do better than that, right? Yeah. So how are you going to do that?
Yeah, I do think that, when you go to a physician today, you do go to the annual physical. If you do, it's recommended.
No, I don't do it.
You don't do it.
Yeah.
See, that's the problem.
Yeah.
Now we are. So you start with that already. So there has to be something more meaningful than going once a year to your physician. He tells you, you should exercise and eat better, and so you already know that. So it's not useful for that.
Right.
So my theory is, and I am a big believer, if you get positive feedback on how you're doing on an ongoing basis of what you're actually doing, and you set small goals, to get there, you would take more control of this, this behavior change. So for example, we know from diets that diets don't work. Everyone knows that. So what you have to change is small things that are achievable on a sustainable basis. So for example, if you say, well, I want to lose 20 pounds, well, it will not start by setting a weight goal. It will start by saying, okay, I'm going to eliminate this from my diet. I'm going to make this small change, and then you see if it's sustainable. The same with exercise. You're not going to set goals to run a marathon. You're going to set a small goal that you increase your exercise from 10 to 30 minutes to 40 minutes, whatever it is. This can be greatly, and it must be, driven by the consumer himself. And I think these devices that give you feedback, give you measurement, give you encouragement, will help you get to that point. There's also a point, there's a little bit of a nudge also. Nobody cares about your wellness in the healthcare system. Nobody. It's all talk, in my view. The only person who cares about wellness is yourself. And there has to be, I think, a realization and some pressure on people that you're on your own with your wellness. Nobody cares. They only care if you're sick.
Right.
Because they get paid for that. They don't get paid for wellness. So who else, if it's not you, will take care of this long-term problem? It might be a dream that you can actually accomplish it, but I've seen changes in people who use systems like that with a digital tracker or without, where they get constant feedback, they get coaching, and you see this gradual behavior change.
And is there some hope, and maybe this is a bad hope, I don't know, that the feedback that a person gets is individualized to what they respond to? So you don't sort of have, it's a bespoke feedback.
Yeah.
And so, but to create bespoke feedback, you need incredible data on the individual and what they respond to.
Yeah, you do. So I found, for example, if that system is linked to a community, so why does Facebook work, for example? It works, right? It changes behavior of people. Why does it work? Because you're tied to a community of like-minded people that have similar goals, and they reinforce each other. Studies have shown that if you have, let's take the diet or exercise thing, if you do this in a community of people that you like, you're more likely to stick to it. You know that who shops or what you buy basically in the grocery store, what you shop and how you eat is influenced by your partner. So that social component has to be integrated into it. It cannot be just one piece. It cannot be just a single goal. And I think based on this dramatic change we've seen in communication behavior from social media, there is a tremendous potential here to tie this to the social aspects. I do think so.
That's fascinating. So I'm looking at the clock, and I see so many of you in front of us, and so this is a great time to break to you and have you ask questions of Martin. I only have 2 requests to keep us moving along. One is, let's make sure you ask 1 question and not 2. And then it would be great if you could end your question with the question mark. So with that, let me just take some questions. Yes, all the way in the back, your hand up, yep.
So thank you for the talk. When we actually look at a lot of the consumer application data that looks at exercise and nutrition tracking, there's a pretty aggressive attrition rate after 3, 6 months, 12 months. What incentives will we have to provide to ensure that the patients continually are giving the data that's required to build out these systems?
Yeah, I think when you take, for example, you take a fitness tracker, a digital watch, there is enough information, 4 or 5 things today that could give you a pretty good idea about your energy balance, for example. How many calories did you burn? How much did you consume based on your weight? And I think you're right, and eventually you need some incentives to stick to it. And you probably need, it could be the community that provides an incentive. I think that works very well. It could also be your health plan that provides incentives. I mean, that is being, at least some studies being done on that. I do think for sustainability, everyone works differently. Not everyone is self-motivated. You probably need some incentives. I personally believe that community is the best way to do it. That's why Weight Watchers works for some people, at least.
You know, it's so interesting. Like, until I heard your talk, I always thought about precision diagnostics as being a device that revealed a genetic mutation. And I thought this was all about genes.
Yeah.
But I listened to you and I realized it's about genes, it's about proteins, but it's also about society. It's about all of these things. It's not just about genes.
Yeah, exactly. I think the biggest mystery in all this is yet the motivational and behavioral aspect. And I personally find that most interesting, how to combine the medical side with these motivational and behavioral changes. It's the most interesting part. I don't believe to change all the healthcare problems we have, we need all the technology that's in development today. I really don't think so. A lot can be done with what we have today. You just have to apply it in a different way. And I think that's where the data science and a lot of things that are available today, but repackaged, repurposed, would make a big difference.
We have mics, 2 in the front and 2 all the way in the back in case you want to ask a question. Yes, sir.
Could you share a little bit of your views on the recent FDA proposed regulation on LDT, the laboratory developed test? What sort of is the prospect of the future prospect of regulating LDT? Is it remain sort of as a congressional issue now rather than just an FDA issue?
What is the test you're referencing?
Just a laboratory developed test, the policy of regulating the IVD versus LDT.
Oh, yeah. Okay, so there's a controversy around what part of the lab industry can be regulated by the FDA. So we, manufacturers, are regulated by FDA. The providers, the labs, are under a different regulation. So this is in discussion for a long time. Laboratories develop their own tests, which for more specialty testing. And they need certain freedom to operate. I think the way the FDA has lately behaved, they will probably not come down hard on this. It doesn't look like it right now. I think they're very cooperative with the industry right now. And the reason why these self-validated tests exist is because it provides faster access to very small volume, very innovative tests. And it's one way for the industry to innovate faster than going through multi-year trials. So I think it will stay, would be my guess.
Martin, and building on that question reminds me of something we see very often, which is folks saying, we're entrepreneurs, we cannot make progress because the entire healthcare delivery system is a mess. There's either too much regulation or too little regulation, and we sort of need to fix all of healthcare before we do our innovation. There are times when I agree with that, but that's not where you were going. I mean, you have this view that it is possible to innovate and add great value and capture a lot of that value in today's system.
Yeah,
absolutely. Want to comment on that?
Yeah, absolutely. The many systems that are today in place for diagnostic tests work quite well, and many tests have an approval rate of time of 4 to 6 months in the U.S. and only on I would say exceptional basis, high-risk devices, it takes much longer. So I think that system works fine. I don't think it's a major impediment to innovation. The impediment of the system is much more about standards of care. So how do you convince, going from a very high-end teaching clinic, how do you convince that clinic to disseminate that innovation down into all the different community hospitals of the country? It just takes time. I think that's imminent to the system, and I have really no idea how you would want to change that. There are companies who've hired specialized sales forces to aggressively promote the product, get faster adoption, similar pharmaceutical model. Yeah, that works in certain cases. It can accelerate it. But it's usually better in this industry to have a range of offerings. So you have existing products that customers use and you improve them. And then you have a range of more innovative offerings in addition. And so you have a portfolio of products that allow you to compete at different levels. So existing products that are more innovative, and over time you will have attractive business. For companies that have only innovative products, you have to go in a very targeted segment. So you can probably partner with an LDT lab, and this is one successful route that I've seen. But even there, it could take 3 or 4 years to get traction commercially.
You mentioned the pharmaceutical model, and when I think about the pharmaceutical model overlaid with the diagnostic testing model, it seems like pharmaceutical companies have a very strong incentive to find tests that predict which patients would benefit from their drug. But from a care delivery point of view, we also want tests that predict who would not benefit from a drug, so that we don't give the drug to the patient who doesn't benefit from it.
Yeah.
That part of the industry should be a part of the industry that is led by payers, for example, right? And we haven't really seen payers say, I'm posing this as a question, but it seems like we haven't seen payers say, give us great diagnostic tests that predict which patients don't benefit from expensive therapies.
Well, it happens to a certain degree, I would say. So if you don't have that mutation, you're not a candidate for this drug. That does happen, I would say. But it's relatively new, I would say. There's also a dilemma about how good is the test. So if you're diagnosed with a serious disease and you're eligible potentially for this drug, this test says you're not a good candidate. Are you sure? Or should we give it a try? And usually it ends up, well, we should try it anyway, because the science is not so black and white. It's not so clear. And that's why many times you probably err on the side of treatment versus not. If the drug has serious side effects, it's a different story. Then you have to have good diagnostics. And then you're working on the risk side.
Right, I was thinking a diagnostic test that predicts toxicity, for example, would be of great value.
Yeah, those are great. Or viral infections for MS drugs like Tysabri and these, there you absolutely need good diagnostics. Yeah, absolutely.
Great. Other questions from the audience?
A lot of the biomarkers that are being developed today are sort of focused on this, like, do you have condition X that can cause me to prescribe a treatment or not? But if your focus is on sort of, can we move to a more wellness set of biomarkers that sort of assess not just your physiology, but maybe how your lifestyle is impacting physiology, where do you see that being developed? And at what point can we start seeing a focus on biomarkers that are maybe more responsive to your health rather than just focus on diagnosing sort of acute conditions?
Question was around more biomarker development, focus on health?
To get to that vision that you said, where can we start measuring people frequently and using that as a feedback model to assess whether your lifestyle is the right lifestyle, you sort of need to be able to select from a proper set of biomarkers. And a lot of the biomarkers probably would not actually lend themselves well to that model just because of the reason for why they were developed to begin with.
Yeah. So on this example that I used here for Bodylogical, they've developed a pretty sophisticated set of biomarkers underneath. I think they're testing for almost 100 different parameters, very much focused on diabetes, and that was validated in clinical studies. And they can use it truly to predict how your propensity for that disease based on those biomarkers. So there's lab tests included, there's physiological data on your metabolism. And that gives you a pretty accurate model for potential interventions. So this is probably the most sophisticated model, and they will go organ, or I would say they call it operating system by operating system of your body. So they will develop this for cardiology as well. And I think they're onto something. It could take many years to develop, but it's I would say it's probably the most advanced mathematical model in healthcare and wellness testing that I've seen.
Martin, going back to kind of your vision for integrating data science into diagnostics, if that is right, it still says that there's a very large barrier to entry on the R&D side, because the folks who have the data are called people like Facebook and Amazon and Google. And if I'm a small diagnostics company, I have to now partner with them. That seems like a huge barrier that I may not be able to overcome. Any thoughts, any advice on on that, or maybe I'm not framing it correctly. Maybe there's other sources of the data that would allow me to do the data science.
Yeah, the way I would think about this is what is your level of competition? So what's your relative advantage? So if you're a small company, you're usually focusing on one little thing that you have. Let's say is you own this one assay for MS and neurodiagnostics. I think that is a very sustainable point of competition. And what you need is you need partners that help you generating the right data on the clinical use. I think in that case, I think you should be fine and you should work with these partners, which could be Google or other players. If it's a pure data science approach, and so the advantage is based on having the data and the science, it would be tough. It would be very difficult.
Yeah.
I don't know if I would try that. So I go back to what is the core competency of the company, what's your competitive advantage, and we focus on that, and it's based on competing with Google and what they're doing. Yeah, that's probably hard to do.
This is amazing, and this is just exactly the right kind of sweeping conversation we were hoping to have in the closing keynote. So thank you for all these absolutely fantastic, inspiring thoughts. Thank you, Martin.
Thank you.
And we're going to break. Thank you.
Good. That was fun.